Africa, a continent that for decades has been associated with poverty, political instability, and conflict in mainstream media. But that narrative is not only outdated, it is outright wrong. This is a story of a rising Africa, a continent of potential, untapped resources, explosive growth, and an emerging force in the global economy.
What if the world's most overlooked continent is actually the one rewriting the future of global growth? For decades, Africa was dismissed as a place where poverty was permanent, where nations stumbled and never quite stood up. Yet today, a quiet but powerful transformation is underway. Poverty rates are falling, economies are expanding, and the story of Africa is no longer one of despair. It's one of momentum. In the early 1990s, economists had nearly given up hope on the developing world. A few exceptions like Singapore and South Korea managed to climb the economic ladder, but the gap between rich nations and the rest of the globe looked unbridgeable. Then came the late 1990s. Global trade surged, new opportunities opened, and the world began to witness something unexpected: the narrowing of that gap. Extreme poverty rates tumbled. By 2022, the share of people surviving on less than $1.90 a day had dropped from 36% in 1990 to under 10%. Africa was part of that change. In 1990, more than half of Africans lived in extreme poverty. By 2022, that figure had fallen to 35%. The numbers are still daunting. Because population growth outpaced progress, the absolute number of poor people rose. Yet, Africa's growth is undeniable. The continent has consistently been among the fastest-growing regions of the world in recent decades. More importantly, the change is not just in raw numbers. It is in how societies, governments, and institutions are beginning to shift. But here's the real question: why do some African countries thrive while others remain stuck? To understand this, economists often split countries into categories: those growing fast, 5% or more annually, and those lagging behind. Between 2013 and 2023, nearly half of African nations crossed the 5% threshold, spanning both resource-rich and resource-poor economies. Surprisingly, many of the strongest performers were not oil exporters or mineral giants, but countries that built their growth on governance, stability, and policy choices. Take Rwanda and Burundi, two small, landlocked nations, both scarred by genocide and instability. In the 1990s, they had similar incomes. Today, Rwanda's income has tripled, while Burundi has sunk to become one of the poorest countries on Earth. The difference? Governance. Rwanda is far from democratic, but its government has been stable, institutions functional, and corruption relatively low. Burundi, by contrast, has been plagued by coups and political strife. The lesson is stark. Even without perfect democracy, a functioning state matters. Another lesson lies in economic choices. Kenya and Tanzania started with nearly identical economies in the 1960s. Both were farming dependent, both under authoritarian one-party states. But Tanzania chose African socialism, nationalizing industries and forcing collective farming. Kenya, meanwhile, embraced market reforms, encouraged investment, and opened export processing zones. Today, Kenyans are 80% wealthier than Tanzanians. The contrast becomes even sharper when you look at Zimbabwe and Botswana. In the early 1980s, Zimbabwe was richer, but Robert Mugabe's reckless policies, printing money, seizing land, ruling by fear, destroyed the economy. Botswana, under Seretse Khama, did the opposite. It invested diamond revenues wisely, built strong institutions, and cracked down on corruption. Now Botswana is 9 times wealthier than Zimbabwe. And then there's Mauritius, Africa's standout success. In the 1960s, Nobel Prize winner James Meade predicted it was doomed, a sugar-dependent island with too many people and too few opportunities. Yet Mauritius proved the world wrong. Through sound policies, social stability, and openness to foreign investment, it grew steadily for decades, earning the nickname the Mauritian Miracle. It remains one of Africa's richest nations today. These stories are not just about numbers. They are about choices. They reveal that Africa's future is not written in its resources, but in its institutions, its policies, and its leadership. For every failure that drags a nation backward, there's an example showing that progress is possible, and sometimes breathtaking. If Africa's success stories prove that progress is possible, then countries like Nigeria remind us just how fragile that progress can be. Nigeria is the continent's largest economy and home to extraordinary wealth in oil, gas, and minerals. Yet, paradoxically, it remains one of the most mismanaged. The very abundance of oil that should have fueled prosperity instead created what economists call the resource curse. Easy money from oil revenues paved the way for corruption, cronyism, and inefficiency. The result is a country that should be a giant of industry, but often struggles with basic services. Transparency. International ranks Nigeria near the bottom of its global corruption index at 150 out of 180. Public institutions too often hire relatives instead of qualified staff, and the state becomes less effective in delivering education, infrastructure, or healthcare. Roads are built slowly, schools remain underfunded, and businesses face endless bureaucratic hurdles. Foreign investors notice this. When corruption is high, the cost of doing business rises, and the willingness to invest falls. The numbers paint the picture clearly. Nigeria's tax-to-GDP ratio is only about 8%, shockingly low when compared to South Africa's 25%. That means less revenue for development, fewer resources for public services, and more reliance on oil exports to plug the gaps. And yet, despite these challenges, Nigeria has not been a total failure. For more than a decade, it recorded strong growth thanks to reforms in non-oil sectors. Technology, agriculture, and entertainment all became new engines of growth. The country's music and film industries have gone global, while fintech startups are reshaping banking for millions. Nigeria's problem, then, is not a lack of talent or opportunity. It is the inability to fully escape the trap of corruption and overdependence on oil. Contrast this with South Africa, the continent's most industrialized and diversified economy. Here lies another paradox. South Africa is wealthier, more advanced, and boasts world-class industries in finance, mining, and manufacturing. It has a growing middle class, solid infrastructure, and technological capacity that makes it Africa's most complex economy. For years after apartheid ended, South Africa benefited from strong institutions and a rare spirit of cooperation among its stakeholders. Businesses, labor unions, and the government believed in working together, which created stability. Growth expanded opportunities, poverty fell, and social grants improved living standards for millions. But South Africa is not immune to corruption or political mismanagement either. In recent years, the country has faced rolling blackouts, unemployment crises, and political scandals that shook investor confidence. Still, its economy remains resilient because it is not dependent on a single resource. When oil prices fall, South Africa does not collapse. Its strength comes from diversification, a lesson other African economies desperately need to embrace. The broader issue across the continent is simple but devastating: corruption. It is the thread running through many of Africa's struggles. It weakens institutions, discourages foreign investment, and erodes trust in governments. A corrupt system not only wastes resources, but also creates a vicious cycle where citizens lose faith in reform and leaders have little incentive to change. And yet, here too, hope persists. Many economists believe Nigeria's economy could be 37% larger if corruption were reduced to levels seen in countries like Malaysia. Imagine what that would mean: more jobs, better schools, stronger infrastructure, and greater global influence. The potential is real, but unlocking it requires political courage and long-term commitment. Beyond individual countries, another trend is reshaping Africa's economic destiny: regional trade. For decades, African nations exported raw commodities to the world, but did little trade with each other. That is beginning to change. Manufactured goods make up just 19% of Africa's exports to the world, but nearly half of what African countries sell to each other. This shift matters. As regional trade deepens, African companies are learning to compete, improve productivity, and build industries that serve not just the global market but their own people. Rwanda is becoming a hub for conferences and high-end tourism. Ethiopia and Lesotho are building factories for textiles. Nigeria is slowly reducing its reliance on oil exports. These are small but significant steps toward a more balanced and resilient economy. Still, the stakes are high. Every month, 1 million young Africans enter the job market. Many of them lack the education and skills to find decent employment. Corruption compounds the problem by draining resources that could be invested in schools and training. Without urgent reform, the mismatch between a booming youth population and limited job opportunities could become explosive. The battle, then, is between Africa's immense potential and the entrenched barriers of corruption and mismanagement. The outcome is not predetermined. The continent's future will be shaped by whether its leaders and its people can turn lessons from success stories into broader reforms. If Africa's past was written in colonial maps and resource exploitation, its future is being written in classrooms, cities, and the restless ambition of its youth. Nowhere else in the world is the population growing as fast or as young. A century ago, Africa had fewer than 100 million people, about a third of Europe's population. Today, Africans outnumber Europeans 2 to 1. By 2050, 1 in every 4 people on Earth will be African. This demographic surge is often described as both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it means a vast labor force, consumers, and innovators ready to shape the future. On the other, it poses the daunting challenge of creating millions of jobs, expanding education, and building infrastructure at unprecedented speed. Every month, about 1 million Africans enter the job market. Too many of them lack the education or skills to secure stable employment. In countries like Mozambique and Madagascar, more than half of children don't finish secondary school. Malnutrition remains stubbornly high, and a third of African children are undernourished. But the story is not one of doom. Across the continent, powerful trends are already pointing toward transformation. More children are in school than ever before. Universities across Africa are expanding, and hundreds of thousands of African students are studying abroad, bringing back skills, networks, and confidence. Migration and remittances are fueling household investments in health and education. Urbanization is creating clusters of innovation, from Lagos to Nairobi to Kigali. And as families become healthier and more prosperous, population growth rates gradually slow, easing the pressure on resources. This is the virtuous cycle that Africa is striving to enter. Stronger institutions encourage investment in education and infrastructure. Better education creates a skilled workforce that drives growth. That growth reduces poverty and strengthens political stability. And stability, in turn, attracts more investment. We've seen this play out in Rwanda, Botswana, and Mauritius. The challenge is to replicate it on a larger scale. The danger, of course, is that not all countries will make it into that cycle. Where corruption persists, where institutions remain weak, and where education fails, the demographic boom could become a demographic time bomb. Millions of frustrated young people without opportunities could drive instability, migration crises, and conflict. The choice is stark, and the consequences global. Africa's future will also be shaped by how it positions itself in the world. For too long, its role in the global economy has been narrowly defined: exporter of raw materials, importer of finished goods. That pattern bleeds wealth out of the continent and leaves countries vulnerable to price swings. But the rise of regional trade agreements and manufacturing hubs suggests a shift. When African nations trade with each other, the benefits stay at home. Productivity rises, industries expand, and global investors begin to see Africa not as a charity case, but as a competitive market. Consider the industries already emerging. Rwanda is branding itself as a destination for conferences and high-end tourism. Ethiopia and Lesotho are pushing into textiles and light manufacturing. Nigeria's tech sector is producing startups that rival Silicon Valley in innovation. South Africa remains a financial and industrial powerhouse. These pockets of progress are signals of what is possible when governance, policy, and investment align. The road ahead is not easy. Corruption still drains billions. Infrastructure lags behind demand. Education systems are uneven. But the potential is extraordinary. Africa is not just catching up. In some areas, like mobile banking, renewable energy adoption, and fintech innovation, it is already leading. The lesson from history is clear. Countries that build institutions, invest in people, and embrace openness thrive. Those that cling to corruption, mismanagement, or outdated ideologies decline. Africa stands at that crossroads. Its population, its resources, and its energy give it the raw ingredients for a historic rise. The question is whether its leaders and its people can seize the moment. Because if they do, the continent that was once written off as hopeless could very well become the beating heart of the global economy in the decades ahead. Now, as you requested, here's the call to action for viewers at the end. What do you think? Will Africa rise to its full potential or remain trapped by corruption and mismanagement? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this report valuable, please support the work by liking this video, sharing it with others, and subscribing to the channel to stay updated on more stories that matter.